Welcome to Down the Warp Pipe. I'm Tyler, and either you've had a holiday of working, a holiday of break, and you're finally back to work. Either way, it's not going to be as much fun as what we're talking about today. Open worlds. A lot of fun to explore, and a lot of fun to get lost in. So, before we get started here, I just wanted to bring to attention that I got a new light, so if I look a little ghost-like, it's because I haven't had a chance to really calibrate things too much here, kind of going in hot. And I originally wanted to talk about another topic today, but didn't have enough time to get all the information in order, and it's going to be a little bit bigger of a topic, so I want to make sure I do it justice. With that said, open world games, this is going to be a bit of a ramble, but I actually feel like they've been around a lot longer than people really feel they have been. The first one that comes to mind in my head that I would consider open world in a like more nebulous sense is Legend of Zelda on the NES. I mean, you went around adventuring a world. There wasn't any separate stages or load screens. You did technically go into dungeons and into caves because it's dangerous to go alone. You should always take an old man's sword, I guess. But regardless, that's kind of where, in my opinion, open world games sort of started. They weren't known as that, and they were just kind of known as games back then. But I mean, obviously, that continued on to things like even Metroid. Metroid is another game that really, if you think about it, kind of has the seeds of what would eventually become what we know as open world games. Obviously, like I said, weren't known like that back then, especially stuff like Super Metroid. You start to get bigger worlds, you get to the Castlevania games, similar sort of sense. But for me, I always felt that open world games really started to kind of get a grasp once we moved into 3D. So if you go, you can kind of start to see the seeds of Mario 64, kind of with the giving you open areas to explore and giving you different sort of objectives in that area. I mean, did have to select them or stumble into them sometimes, but it's not quite an open world, but you see the seeds of what would eventually become there. And a lot of people will point to GTA 3 as the first real open world game. By my standards, if you look at GTA 1 and 2, those still were open world in a sense. Again, not as we know them today, but you could kind of see the seeds of what would eventually sprout into open world gaming, or open world games specifically. I just feel like it's enveloped most of gaming these days, so it's almost as ubiquitous as RPG mechanics these days. It's really hard to separate the two of them, but it's really hard to get them out of most games. There's obvious exceptions to that, but today we're talking about the open world games. For me, the real one that kind of felt like an open world game at first, and I actually remember calling it an open world game way back when I was in, I want to say grade 8. I could be wrong. It could be grade 7. I think it was grade 7 actually, now to think of it. But um, Ocarina of Time to me was really the first game that I felt was an open world. I actually remember calling it that. No one, at least to my knowledge, had mentioned the word open world game before. And for me, I just kind of assumed it was because you were going from area to area, but it didn't really feel like there was a load time or they were separate sections. The whole world felt interconnected. I know a lot of people would probably disagree with that, but in my opinion, that's actually the first open world game that I personally experienced. I'm sure there's exceptions to this where there's other games that existed on PC, and as I mentioned, some of the earlier ones, I have no problem if you consider them open world games. I don't really think they have the full experience in them, but they do start to show where those things are going. For me, lately I've been playing a whole lot of open world games, mostly because I'm catching up on some backlog, most notably Breath of the Wild right now. I've recently just finished up Horizon Zero Dawn and its expansion, which, I mean, are obvious open world games, but there's also some really good classics in there too. World of Warcraft, it's an MMO, but I think that it's really important to mention that prior to World of Warcraft, MMOs actually had instancing or separate zones that really did feel separate. If you played EverQuest or any of sort of the earlier MMOs, they didn't actually have this kind of seamless world that you could run into. And so it really felt different going into something like World of Warcraft, even compared to something that came out afterwards, like Guild Wars, which wasn't really a full on MMO until the sequel, I feel, but um, it did have these kind of instance separate zones, and it made it feel kind of separate. Like you'd come to a hub world, meet up with your buddies, and go on an adventure. So, more in the lines of something like Division, if you played that. That is more what Guild Wars was and what MMOs were prior to World of Warcraft. And for me, that's kind of what differentiates sort of an open world versus a not open world, even though a lot of those games that I did mention, like Division 2, most people would consider an open world nowadays. And while I feel they have elements of open world, they're not like a full sort of expansive MMO experience. They're kind of in this middle ground. And although they're still open world, they're not like a full-fledged open world because there is that separate instancing of going to town and seeing everyone else run around. I actually kind of like that personally, so I'm not knocking it. It's just there's a lot of kind of flavors of it nowadays. But I mean, you really kind of started to see what open world games were once you got to kind of, for me, past Grand Theft Auto 3, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Vice City, and you got to the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation with games like Assassin's Creed and sort of what that has spun off into. And then the Arkham series, uh, Skyrim, obviously. I mean, you had Oblivion before that, but those kind of had noticeable load times. Even going back to something like Half-Life 2, it doesn't have this seamless kind of experience in the story that you would expect from something nowadays. And it has kind of these loading checkpoints, which feel really weird and archaic. Obviously, like Skyrim still has that, but it's considered an open world game because for the most part, everything within the world is interconnected. And I think that's a really big differentiating factor. You can have open world and you can have not interconnected. So I think that's something that kind of gets glazed over a lot with games. You have just open world games, there they are. And you actually have a lot of varieties in them. You have sort of instanced open worlds, you have connected open worlds, and I mean, there's also different kinds of designs. Something like a Dark Souls, it is open world. It doesn't necessarily feel like that, but when you go back to Demon Souls, that's definitely not an open world in a traditional sense. It's more along the lines of something like Mario 64. You have these different archstones that you go into, but they're not fully open. They're kind of linear in a sense. There is a progression to them, even if some of the progression tends to be twisting and turning. But for me, the big thing is with open world games, they're really interesting and fun to experience, but sometimes they can feel kind of big and overwhelming almost. Like I said, I'm going back through, well, not going back through, I'm finishing up my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild. I originally wanted to go through and get at least the 441 Korok seeds that you can get in order to unlock your maximum inventory. Yeah, that's not happening. It basically took me to about 170 or so, and I said, no, not doing this anymore. I'm more than halfway through all the shrines, but I'm gonna commit to myself on getting all the shrines at least. They're fun, and I don't want to miss out on that. And I don't feel like it's something that I'm going to immediately jump back into and do a second playthrough on, like I know a lot of people are nowadays, because I have so many other great games that I need to still finish up or go through. Something like Red Dead Redemption 2, another amazing open world game, but the world kind of, you're there for the experience of the world. And in other open world games, the world is there to kind of provide you set dressing. Something, for an example of that, I would say is God of War or the Dark Souls series, where the world is really connected and kind of spirally and goes around itself, but there's not a lot of big empty space unless there needs to be for a story reason or for an atmospheric reason. Whereas you go to something like Red Dead Redemption 2, Breath of the Wild, the Assassin's Creed games, and there's just massive open space and a bunch of things to do in it. Something like The Witcher 3, for example, I haven't even decided to touch yet. It's definitely something that's on my radar. I actually, for a first in my life, read the novels before playing the games and really love that world. Just the size and the scope of the additional content really, really puts me off. I don't want to play a 400-hour game. I'd rather play 4 100-hour games, or realistically, for me, I think the best balance has been something like God of War, where you get about 35 to 40 hours and you can experience, if not all, most of the game and the side content and everything like that. I don't need one game to last me for 100, 400, 500 hours. On the other side, if I do want to play through a second time or do want to go on different difficulties or something like that, those are great options to have. But in an open world game, I feel like you're really there for the experience of the world, at least for me. I mean, there's a lot of things I like and a lot of things I dislike with open world. I can pick them here and there. I love the atmosphere, but I hate the amount of time investment it can take. Sometimes jumping into a level of Neo 2 is a lot more comfortable for me to do, even though I might still spend an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours in it, than saying, I'm going to jump back into Breath of the Wild and I'm going to need at least half an hour to do something that feels meaningful. Yeah, you can teleport around, but if you don't know the amount of time you're going to have for, say, your wife or your husband or a kid or a friend decide, hey, let's do something else, you don't always want to jump into a big open world experience. For me, I tend to play multiplayer games a lot with friends, especially these days. So jumping into an open world game can be a lot of fun, but I like to know that my friends aren't going to hop online and be like, let's play some Fall Guys, or let's play some Ghost of Tsushima, or any number of other games that we have that we're just kind of picking up and playing here and there. So I like to make sure I've at least got like an hour. I have a rough idea of when my friends will come online. So I mean, that definitely helps. But for me, the problem right now is kind of getting through the backlog of open world games I have. Anything that's not open world, I've been playing through and beating pretty continuously. But anything that's open world has always kind of felt a little daunting. I haven't jumped into Assassin's Creed Valhalla yet, but I'm super excited to do it once I beat Breath of the Wild, and I'm a little more than halfway through that at this point. I would actually say probably close to halfway though, maybe like 55%. But once I get that done, I'll jump into that. And the thing that really struck me with Assassin's Creed Valhalla is being told that the open world has all of these objectives, but it doesn't show everything to you. So that's another thing that can happen with open world games that was bothering me when I was sort of going through and mapping out where the Korok seeds are using the interactive map that's available online. I'll leave a link in the description actually if you want to use that. It's been a fantastic tool. But the best way of kind of experience that game for me was marking things on the map and then kind of going through them. And yeah, that's where I decided that the Korok seeds, I was just going between shrine to shrine, but that map of Korok seeds was just completely overwhelming. For me, a great open world game would be something that has the story, tells you where the story is, but lets you kind of find those little nuggets to give you extra side content that isn't required. So you have your main story, you have the side story missions, but then you have like little activities sprinkled throughout, and those aren't marked on the map. Those are kind of there for you to discover if you want to explore the world. They don't necessarily give you anything meaningful, but a lot of the objectives in these games aren't meaningful aside from the main story and the side missions, unless you're going for that platinum trophy, in which case, yeah, don't tie the trophies to these side activities. That's totally fine. Maybe tie the trophy to having completed 1 or 10 or something small compared to the amount that are available there. Anyways, that's going to be it for this week. Unfortunately, like I said, I wanted to do something much bigger, but have to wrap this up, and I'll see you guys next Games Tuesday. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this if you enjoy it. Like I said, going to be coming back next week. Hopefully I'm not as ghosty. I'll get the chance to figure out the lighting a bit more, but we'll get something a little bit more in-depth next week. I'm not sure which one I'm going to do. I have 2 ideas I'm tossing around, but we'll see what I decide, and we'll see you next Games Tuesday.